Hello everyone, it's Silver. This is Earth Defense Force 6. So I'm a huge fan of this series. I should probably just go ahead and say that right from the start, because this series is kind of like the Warriors games, like Dynasty Warriors and Samurai Warriors and stuff, in that there is a sort of niche, hardcore demographic that really loves them, but a lot of people really don't like them, and oftentimes the reasons for who likes them and who doesn't are actually the same between the two different people. But I've actually been a fan of Sandlot's games since the PS2 era, with their earlier entries in this series and other games like Robot Alchemic Drive, just being these really unique, sort of quirky takes on these huge-scale B-movie style science fiction concepts. And this one in particular is a really neat entry because it's basically a sort of graduation of what the series has become up until this point. It's the same thing, but more, a lot more. It is recognizably Earth Defense Force, but more varied in every way. So I should probably just start by saying, if you're not a fan of EDF games, this is probably not the one that's going to change your mind, because it is still EDF. It does what it does to a really high level of competence, in my opinion, and a huge amount of variety, but it's still recognizably the same formula, and if you weren't a fan of it in, say, EDF 5, then you're probably not going to be a fan of it here either. For me personally, I think this is now my favorite EDF game because of the huge focus on variety and the really interesting story elements. I'll get into that later in its own kind of spoilery section, but I'll warn you before then. So what the heck is Earth Defense Force if you've never played one? These are third-person sci-fi shooters that are focused on massive hordes of aliens and things, and cutting through really large numbers of enemies and extremely large maps. The sense of scale is part of these games' appeal, and the way that Sandlot does scale has always been really interesting to me, because they are one of the few developers that can make truly huge things feel huge. The way that buildings feel, the way that really large enemies feel and stuff, the way that explosions feel even. It's just the scale of all of those things can feel super impressive. The way that these engines feel has always really emphasized scale. So things like height and distance and stuff have a kind of a uniquely large feel in this engine. And that continues with this game. And there's been a bit of an improvement to the physics, both in terms of the enemies' physics having a bit more weight to them, so things kind of move around with a little bit more of a weighty feel, especially the larger, more metallic enemies. They kind of clank around awkwardly and stuff in a way that feels physically realistic, I suppose, or at least authentic. But the buildings and the overall environmental destruction has also been improved, because now, rather than the way that buildings used to work, where once they took enough damage they sort of sank into the ground in a big dust cloud and were destroyed that way, now they actually become physics objects that can be broken apart into smaller pieces and sort of roll around the map. You'll also find that there are quite a few enemy types, a large number of enemy types, that have sort of a physics-based destruction on them and can be peeled apart or have elements of themselves amputated or destroyed, and even regrown in some cases. You have the 4 classic classes to choose from. You can switch between them at any time, and whichever one you want to play. You've got the Ranger, who is your sort of jack-of-all-trades soldiery character with a really large variety of equipment that makes them suitable for just about any situation, and they have a really nice dodge roll that can now break through small barriers and stuff. You've got the Air Raider, which is your sort of support class, although they are also really effective in terms of pure destruction because of what they can call down. These are your guys that carry a lot of sort of indirect and support weapons, like a lot of sort of sticky bomb launchers and things of that nature, rather than your usual like assault rifles and shotguns, although they still have things like that they can access too. And they can call down vehicles and other support things like bombing runs, artillery strikes, rocket artillery, and just a huge variety of vehicles up to and including big mechs and stuff. So they have quite a lot of versatility on the battlefield. You've got the Fencer. These are your heavy boys. These guys have basically power armor on, and this allows them to use 4 weapons at once, 2 in each hand and 2 on the shoulders. And they have all sorts of really heavy weaponry like big canister shotguns, rocket launchers, miniguns that they can even quad wield if you want, and some other things like that. The big linear cannons and laser cannons and stuff are pretty cool too. And these guys are of course a lot slower in terms of walking around, but have a lot of armor and are really tough in general. But they have a deceptive speed to them, because they have a lot of melee weapons like hammers and lances and stuff that often give them the ability to use these dashes and sort of jump jets and stuff, so they can actually move really quickly if you know how to use them. And then you've got my personal main class choice, the Wing Diver. Wing Divers are really fragile but really fast characters that use energy weapons pretty much entirely. So they have a lot of different sort of highly destructive weapon choices, but they are all based on this energy resource that they also use to fly around. So they've got to be careful about not running out of energy in a bad place, because then they will have no mobility whatsoever while their energy is recharging, and they're super fragile, so you don't want to have that happen in the middle of like 8,000 ants or something. The four classes have a lot of their traditional weapons that you'll be used to if you've played games like EDF5, for instance. This is actually a direct sequel to EDF5, by the way. The games aren't always necessarily sequels to each other story-wise and world-wise, but in this case, 5 was kind of a bit of a continuity reboot, and this is a sequel to that. But they've also got a lot of new stuff to each of them, and in fact, this game has the largest selection of weapon variety that the games have ever had. This is the number one in terms of how much stuff there is for you to find. And to facilitate this, as well as having a lot of new weapons and stuff, each of the classes has some new slots to put new things in. A lot of like deployable slots, things like grenades and stuff, which used to be put in the normal weapon slots, now have their own slot. And like, for instance, the Wing Diver has a deployable slot where you can use all sorts of new pieces of equipment, like these big sabers that you can use to do really huge damage, melee range slashes if you're sort of doing like hit and run tactics. And there are also like deployable energy orbs and big plasma grenades and stuff that you can use. And pretty much all the classes have something like this, some sort of new slots that allow you to give them some extra features and give you a bunch of new stuff to collect. As you are out in a mission destroying enemies, they will drop crates, and different enemies have different drop rates for varying numbers of crates. There are 4 different kinds. There are 2 healing crates, a small one and a large one, that heal you and anyone that's currently in your squad, including NPCs, a little bit or a lot, depending on which one you collect. There's also the red armor crates, which will give you more maximum health at the end of the mission, although 1 crate does not equal 1 armor. Each of the 4 classes has a different sort of formula for how many crates equals 1 armor. And then there are the ever sought after green weapon crates, and these will give you some new equipment when you collect them. Although the way these games work is you can also get duplicates of weapons you already have, and this can actually be a good thing because all of the weapons have a large selection of different numbers, different statistics, damage, rate of fire, reload speed, all that stuff that can be quantified. And when you pick up a duplicate of a weapon you already have, it may have a better one of some of these stats, and if that happens, it will update the one that you have with the stats. So basically you could say that every weapon is a set weapon, but it has kind of a range of rolls that it can drop as, depending on each of its different statistics. And as you collect that weapon multiple times, the one that you can equip in your equipment screen will have the best version of each one of those statistics that you found so far. And the gameplay loop is a very simple one. You'll choose a mission, go into that mission, and have some basic objectives, which will always boil down to a whole bunch of monsters spawn, kill the monsters. Basically, there's no way to complete these missions without killing everything on the map, although there are some missions where some extra stuff will spawn at the end to show how screwed you are, but for the most part, the idea is that you clear the maps out entirely. And this is another place where this game has been improved by variety, because one of the biggest criticisms I often see levied at Earth Defense Force as a series is that a lot of it boils down to shooting ants. And while that is certainly true to an extent, this game has more enemy variety than any previous EDF game to date, and it also introduces them a lot faster. For instance, the very first combat mission that you do will actually have you facing off against some of the frog soldier dudes with shotguns in a sort of destroyed city area. And this is an unusual way to start an EDF game. Usually it's all about that ant invasion at first, but this game doesn't start like that. And in fact, the way that this game's pacing works is quite a bit different from previous EDF games, even EDF5. Because of this drastically increased enemy variety, they're sort of able to really increase the stakes really quickly. You'll find that the missions get harder more quickly, in my opinion, and overall I think this game is more difficult than its predecessor. Even familiar enemies that are usually introduced in a very specific way have a more difficult entry here. Like, for instance, the Aranea enemies, which are big, huge spiders. Usually these are introduced in a mission in a big cityscape where you have lots of skyscrapers everywhere. The spiders are making webs in between all the skyscrapers, and they will shoot these long-distance webs at you and slowly pull you in. But it's a relatively easy mission, usually, because you have a lot of big, tall buildings that you can use to line of sight the enemy webs and keep yourself untangled and be able to destroy the enemies in a pretty nice like grid format because you're in a big city area. In this game, the Aranea are introduced in a new Hot Springs town map, which is a lot more sort of countryside, no big skyscrapers, a lot of lower enemies and hillsides and stuff, and sort of a lot more complicated topography, and it makes the mission a lot more difficult because you can't do the whole line of sight them in a big concrete grid thing anymore. It's a much more complex layout for the mission, so it's the familiar enemy, but it's done in a very unfamiliar way. And in combination with this, you've also just got the fact that there are a lot more enemy variants that you'll be finding, like the big spiders that can fire out electrified webs, or the silver spiders, or the glowing-eyed ants, of which there are several different varieties, including the big, like mother ants versions of them and stuff. And also you'll be finding some enemies that were in previous games, but a lot sooner than usual, like the golden ants, for instance, which in previous EDF games often only appeared on higher difficulties, now will even start showing up on normal mode like 2/3 of the way through the campaign. So yeah, in terms of enemy variety, we've got just a huge amount in this game. And map variety has also been increased, so there are a lot more levels to choose from, and because of the way the story works, the maps also have some pretty significant variants to them sometimes, but again, we'll get into that a little bit later. The difficulty system works as it usually does in this series, where you have easy, normal, and hard unlocked at first, with higher difficulties having tougher enemies, sometimes new enemy spawns, as well as dropping higher level loot, so you can get better stuff that way. And then once you get through the game the first time, you'll also unlock Hardest and Inferno, the two higher difficulties, which are very difficult and often add a lot of new enemy variants and stuff that you don't otherwise see, and have, of course, a lot of new stuff to reward you with the highest level drops available being on Inferno mode. But yeah, good luck with that. It does get very challenging once you get up that high. So yeah, the story. There is a much more significant story element this time around than there usually is for EDF. EDF is more about the mass destruction than it is the story, but there is a story that actually changes how the game plays in this case. So I gotta talk about it, and it's actually pretty neat. So if you don't want any spoilers on the story and just want to skip to my conclusions, then skip to this time right here, and that will take you past all the spoiler talk. I can't believe I'm saying that about an EDF game, but here we are. So this time around, the story involves time travel. You actually start out 3 years after the end of EDF 5, in the beginning of this game, where humanity technically won the war against the Primers, the alien civilization that was attacking them, but not very well, and about 90% of humanity has been wiped out. And the Primers are starting to attack again with some sort of leftover forces, and the remnants of humanity are just trying to survive. However, a big, huge ring ship appears in the sky and starts sort of absorbing other ships and things, and it's actually sending them back in time. So what's basically happening is this ship is sending back forces to the beginning of the war now that they know how it's going to go, so that they can intercept all the things that humanity did and change the course of history so that they win. And you are able to destroy a part of this ring, which sort of causes a malfunction that sends you back in time as well as one other person, this scientist guy. So it's you and him trying to figure out what's going on, and you will basically be repeating missions, but they change every time. You'll actually go back and do some EDF 5 missions, some missions straight from that game, but they'll have changes because they're trying to change around history, so they'll have new enemy types and different objectives because they are actively trying to change how it happened in the first place. There are several different timelines that you'll actually be traveling between, and you will repeat this process a couple of times, going from the sort of nearly dead future to the past at the beginning of this war, to the sort of end of the war, to the future again, and then back. And then you'll do this across a couple of different timelines, and there's actually like 4 or 5 different character models for each class that change the level of overall technology and stuff depending on what timeline you're in, which is a cool little touch. And you'll also be coming across different maps that will change depending on what's happened. Like, for instance, there's a big destroyed cityscape versus a huge, like, sci-fi cityscape of the future, depending on if humanity is doing well or not, and you'll go between different ones. There's also a city map with a huge kind of bald spot in the middle that's a big construction project that's being worked on, and in one of the timelines it actually gets finished, so that map changes to have a big huge building there instead, which is a nice touch. So you will be going back and forth between these different timelines trying to thwart what they're doing while they're trying to thwart what you're doing. So you'll sort of be one-upping each other, trying to use your knowledge of the future to alter the past to your favor. And in fact, apparently the creator of the game had this idea planned back when they made EDF 5, so if you go back and play that game, there are some hints that this is actually happening. I really like this idea for a plot because it's effectively sci-fi kaiju B-movie style that fits with EDF, but it's also kind of unique in the way that it informs the gameplay because it changes the level of technology you'll be facing, the different enemy types you'll be facing, and the maps you'll be facing them in. So it's a type of story that actually fits well with the gameplay because it changes how the gameplay works a bit. And I think honestly, in a very gameplay mechanics focused series like EDF, it fits. It makes the most sense to do a story that does it this way, that actually works with the gameplay, because otherwise it might just be kind of hanging off of it, you know, like a plot hanging off of the gameplay in a way that feels vestigial or unnecessary, but it doesn't feel that way since they work together. It's also kind of clever because these are more budget games and they do need to go through some asset reuse and stuff to make sure they can bulk themselves out. And being able to do that, to reuse some previous missions and stuff, but make them actively different and not play the same repeatedly, is a clever way to do that sort of thing, you know? It allows you to reuse some EDF 5 missions, but change them substantially so that they're still new. So, aside from all that story stuff, there's also one other element in which this is the largest EDF game to date. Aside from the enemy and weapon variety and stuff, there's also the missions themselves. There are 147 of them, I believe. It's a really, really long campaign, and considering the higher difficulties, as is usually the case for this game, change the missions a bit because they'll have new enemy types and some new threats and stuff to deal with. That's a lot. There's a lot of missions to go through, and it will definitely keep you busy for a long time, and of course everything is playable in co-op as well. There are also 2 DLC mission packs that were made available for this game in Japan. They are on the menu here, but they're not currently available for purchase at the time that I'm recording this. Hopefully those get sent over relatively soon, because they do add some really cool new enemy types and a lot of fun new things to do. So like they're really varied and interesting DLC packs that have a lot of new gameplay to them. But yeah, we don't currently have those just yet. But overall, my view on this game is that it's the best EDF that I think I've played. As someone who's played this series since the PlayStation 2 days, I really, really love these games for all that they are, including the warts. I love them for how silly they are and how ridiculous the voice acting is, and how amazing the weapons are, and yeah, a lot of the stuff about them is not mass appeal. These are not games that are ever going to sell millions and millions of copies and be given all the awards on your favorite journalist's game show. But they are colorful and fun, and don't forget the arcadey joy of cutting through 80,000 ants. And I love them for all of the silliness that they represent. And in my view, because of the huge focus on variety in every aspect, this game does kind of win out among the previous games as just being my new favorite. Because hey, there's just a lot to it. There's a lot here to enjoy. On the technical side, and in terms of, you know, bugs and stuff, it's a little bit weird. On my desktop, this game runs flawlessly. I've had no problems with it whatsoever on my main desktop PC. No frame drops, no crashing, nothing at all. It works just fine. And aside from the ones that are trying to eat you all the time, there aren't really any major bugs that I've noticed. However, on some other systems, this can change. Like, for instance, the Steam Deck. On the Steam Deck, I cannot finish a single mission on this game. I don't know why. I've tried every tweak I can think of, every alteration to the settings, to limiting frame rate, to all sorts of stuff, and nothing works. It just crashes constantly. And these are really fun games to play on the Steam Deck, so hopefully that gets fixed up, and some patches will come out to fix the stability on certain kinds of systems. The only other complaint I have is that sometimes the sound mixing is a little weird in this game, especially around specific enemy types, like the Scylla, for instance, the big professional wrestler fish dudes. They, for some reason, all of the sounds associated with them, from you attacking them to them attacking you, all of the sounds around them are like eardrum smitingly loud, and I don't know why. Even when all the other sounds are normalized and at a good volume and everything else is comfortable, these guys will cause you like permanent hearing loss all the time, and I don't know what's up with it. But I really would like for them to maybe tone that down a little bit, because all of the sounds relating to those guys do not need to be that loud. But yeah, that is Earth Defense Force 6, a highly varied and really fun time if you're a fan of the series. If you're not, it probably won't pull you in unless you were already on the fence. So thank you guys very much for watching. I'll put the link in the description below this video, as always, to the Steam store page for EDF 6 if you wish to check it out yourselves, and I'll see you next time.